I want to begin in a kitchen, because that is where a lot of financial truth reveals itself. Not on a yacht, not in a trading room, not in a boardroom with polished tables and expensive coffee. In a kitchen, early in the morning, when the house is still quiet and a man is looking at his phone before the day starts, doing arithmetic in his head that he does not want to admit he is doing again. He is not broke. That is what makes the whole thing so dangerous. He is not the man people point to when they want a simple cautionary tale. He is not blowing money in casinos. He is not buying watches he cannot afford with money he does not have. He is not acting like a fool in most cases. He is doing exactly what the world told him a decent man was supposed to do. He worked hard. He became more useful. His income rose. He bought a better house because his family needed room. He bought a safer car because his children sat in the back seat. He moved into the better school district because that is what a caring father does. He said yes to responsibilities because that is what serious men do. And then one day, usually 5 and 45, he discovers that the very life that made him look successful from the outside has begun to function like a machine that eats every dollar he makes and every ounce of freedom he has. That decade is one of the most misunderstood decades in personal finance. People think the great financial mistakes happen in your 20s when you are careless, or in your 60s when you are running out of time. They do not pay enough attention to the middle stretch, the years when income is rising, identity is hardening, and commitments stop feeling temporary. That is the decade when a man can quietly build a fortress or quietly build a cage. From the outside, those two structures often look exactly the same. I have spent most of my life watching people confuse comfort with strength, income with wealth, and social proof with sound judgment. I have also watched men in this age band make very rational-sounding decisions that left them more exposed, more tired, and less financially free than they were 10 years earlier. Even while they were earning more money than ever before. That is the part nobody warns you about. The trap does not announce itself as a trap. It arrives dressed as maturity. It arrives dressed as responsibility. It arrives dressed as love for your family. It arrives dressed as a reward you have earned. And because it does not look reckless, you do not challenge it. You absorb it into your identity. You tell yourself this is simply what adulthood costs. Then you keep walking deeper into it until the day you realize the life you built now requires your full cooperation every month just to remain standing. I want to say something plainly. The most dangerous financial word in that decade is not debt. It is obligation. Debt is obvious. Obligation is stealthy. A man can see a credit card bill and know he has a problem. But a man can live for years inside a beautifully decorated structure of mortgage payments, car payments, tuition commitments, insurance bills, family expectations, recurring subscriptions, property tax increases, maintenance costs, social norms, and quiet promises he made to himself about what success was supposed to look like, without ever calling any of it a problem. He simply calls it life. But money does not care what story you tell yourself. Money keeps score another way. It asks one ruthless question: how much of your monthly income is already spoken for before you make a single free decision? That number matters more than. I have always believed that if you want to understand a person's financial condition, do not begin with income. Begin with the break. Even point. Begin with the amount of money required every month to keep the machine from shaking. Begin with the number beneath which fear begins. A man making $200,000 a year with very high fixed obligations may be poorer in the way that matters than a man making $90,000 with a low break. Even point and real room to maneuver. The first man has status. The second man has optionality. If you force me to choose which one has the better future, I will choose optionality every time. The market teaches the same. A business with enormous revenues and no margin for error is fragile. A business with modest revenues and strong margins can survive shocks, adapt, and compound. Most men understand this when they look at companies. They forget it when they look at their own households. Let us talk about the first trap. The first trap is upgrading your lifestyle before you have built durable financial stability. This is not a story about extravagance. It is a story about timing. A raise comes in. Maybe it is the first truly meaningful jump in income. Maybe you cross into six figures. Maybe your business has a strong year. Maybe for the first time you feel that the younger version of you would be impressed by what you are making. And because the increase feels like a rival, you begin converting income into fixed costs before you have converted income into assets. That is the mistake. You move into the bigger house. You take on the higher mortgage. You buy the newer vehicle. You normalize the better restaurants, the better vacations, the better everything. At first it feels reasonable because every single upgrade can be justified on its own. Better schools, better safety, better reliability, better quality of life, better neighborhood, better network. The rationalizations are not false. That is why the trap is so powerful. It is built from half-truths. The problem is not that each individual expense is insane. The problem is that every upgrade raises the floor under your life. When the floor rises high enough, freedom disappears. A house is never just the mortgage. That is a child's understanding of housing cost. A house is property tax, insurance, repairs, maintenance, furnishings, heating, cooling, landscaping, the invisible pressure to match the standard of the neighborhood, and all the money that never gets invested, because the house consumes the surplus first. Once a man understands that, he stops asking whether he can qualify for the house and starts asking what the house will demand from the next 15 years of his life. That is a much better question. The same thing happens with vehicles. People talk about car payments as though the payment is the decision. It is not. The decision is the life structure behind the payment. The payment is simply the monthly reminder. A financed vehicle is not transportation alone. It is an agreement to export future cash flow toward a depreciating object for years. If that agreement is modest and intentional, it may not do much harm. If it is oversized and driven by identity, it quietly steals investing power, flexibility, and peace of mind. I have never thought much of using a temporary income increase to lock in a permanent cost increase. That is the arithmetic of stress. A lot of men between 35 and 45 are not actually short of income. They are short of margin. That is different. Income can look healthy while margin is dying. And if margin dies, eventually confidence dies with it. Because every job setback, every economic slowdown, every health problem, every surprise repair, every school bill, and every market decline becomes dangerous at the same time. The second trap is financing comfort when you should be buying flexibility. This one is subtle because comfort has moral appeal in the middle years of life. A young man can tolerate inconvenience. A middle-aged man with children, deadlines, aging parents, and less energy often feels he has earned relief. He is tired. He wants fewer rough edges. He wants some ease. That instinct is understandable. I am not mocking it. But I do want to separate comfort from the method used to purchase it. If you pay cash for something modest and it simplifies your life without compromising your future, that may be sensible. If you finance comfort by selling away future flexibility, that is often foolish, even when it looks respectable. Flexibility is an asset class, though nobody writes about it that way. Flexibility is the ability to leave a bad job. Flexibility is the ability to survive a lean year. Flexibility is the ability to say no when a client, a boss, or a partner pushes you into an arrangement that insults your judgment. Flexibility is the ability to help your family from a position of strength instead of panic. Flexibility is what allows a man to make one intelligent decision after another because he is not desperate. Lose that, and every decision becomes contaminated by urgency. A finance comfort purchase often feels small when measured monthly. That is how people get tricked. They stop thinking in terms of total cost and start thinking in terms of monthly survivability. As soon as a man begins evaluating everything by the payment, rather than by the obligation and the lost future returns of the money, he has shifted from owner thinking to captive thinking. I do not like captivity, especially when it arrives disguised as convenience. The third trap is saying yes to obligations that permanently raise your brake. Even point. This is where many decent men get themselves into trouble, because the obligation often emerges from generosity, loyalty, or love. They co-sign something. They absorb a partner's burden without carefully restructuring the household. They commit to a tuition level that cannot be supported without permanent pressure. They say yes to helping family members in a way that becomes recurring rather than temporary. They stretch for the larger house because they imagine caring for parents later. They become the quiet financial backstop for everybody around them. Again, many of these decisions can be morally admirable. I am not telling a man to stop caring for family. I am telling him to calculate the long-term structural cost of every promise before the promise becomes part of his identity. One of the most expensive habits in personal finance is noble improvisation. A man sees a need, wants to do the right thing, and commits before he has examined what that commitment does to the next decade of his life. A disciplined man does not stop being generous. He becomes more strategic about the form generosity takes. He understands that a household with no margin eventually becomes a household that can help nobody for long. Raising the brake. Even point is not like buying a one-time indulgence. It is much worse. It is changing the required speed of the treadmill. And once that speed rises, you may find that the job you tolerate, the city you remain in, the projects you accept, the clients you keep, and the risks you cannot take are all being determined by commitments you barely questioned when you made them. That is not prosperity. That is a disguised loss of sovereignty. The fourth trap is mistaking income growth for financial progress. This is the trap of the competent man. He works hard, becomes better, earns more, and assumes that the upward line in income must mean the upward line in wealth is also taking place. Sometimes it is. Often it is not. Income is what comes in. Wealth is what remains. And wealth becomes meaningful only when it begins to detach your future from your next paycheck. A man earning far more than he used to earn can still be in nearly the same condition he was 10 years ago if every gain has been converted into a larger lifestyle rather than into ownership of assets. The machine is bigger, but the freedom is not. That is why high-income stress is real. It is not an illusion. It is the result of building a more expensive structure without building a proportionately stronger financial foundation beneath it. You see it everywhere. A household gets to a savings milestone, a retirement milestone, or an income milestone and treats it as proof that more lifestyle can now be safely supported. That is backward. A milestone is not permission to inflate your life. It is raw material. It is foundation. It is the first moment when real compounding can begin to matter if you leave it alone long enough. I have said for years that the first $100,000 is important, not because $100,000 is a magical number, but because reaching any genuine base of capital changes the nature of your relationship to time. Your labor is doing nearly all the work. After the base exists, capital starts helping. But if every milestone gets translated into more obligations, then the help never arrives. You keep resetting the starting line. That is how capable men stay financially immature while appearing successful. Now, I want to explain why this decade is uniquely dangerous. First, the income tends to be higher, and higher income can hide stupidity better than low income can. Waste, leakage, drift, and soft financial negligence are easier to ignore when cash flow is strong enough to keep the lights on. Many men only discover the truth of their structure during a shock because normal times were rich enough to conceal it. Second, time pressure is savage in this decade. Career demands rise. Children require attention. Parents age. Health begins to matter in a way it did not matter at 28. Fatigue sets in, reflection becomes a luxury. And when reflection disappears, inertia takes over. A man begins living by momentum. He keeps renewing structures. He has not reevaluated because he is too busy carrying them. Third, status hardens. By this stage, a man often feels he is no longer allowed to look uncertain, experimental, or modest. He has an image to maintain. The peer group matters. The neighborhood matters. The school district matters. The car in the driveway matters more than he will admit. When identity fuses with visible consumption, good judgment becomes socially expensive. That is why so many men defend the very structure that is slowly suffocating them. They are not defending mathematics. They are defending self-image. I am very interested in self-image because it quietly governs spending more than spreadsheets do. If a man needs external markers to feel that he is progressing, then reducing those markers will feel like humiliation, even if the reduction materially improves his future. But if a man understands that true status is the ability to remain calm, solvent, and free while others are overstretched, then he begins to value a different kind of life. I have never been impressed by the man who can buy the expensive thing. I am impressed by the man who can buy it, fully afford it, and still decide he would rather own flexibility. That man understands power. Let us talk about the real long-term costs of these traps. The first cost is delayed compounding. A great many men in this age band believe they still have plenty of time. In one sense they do. 35 is not old, 40 is not old, 45 is not old, but there is a difference between not being late and using your prime compounding window intelligently. 10 years of drift in your midlife household can cost you a shocking amount of future optionality. When people think about compounding, they often think only in terms of return percentages. That is too abstract. A better way to think about compounding is this: every dollar that escapes consumption and gets placed into productive assets begins working on your behalf instead of requiring your future labor. Delay that conversion long enough and you force your older self to keep carrying burdens your younger self should have transferred to capital. That is a miserable trade. The second cost is chronic stress disguised as adulthood. This is a subject I care about because financial strain does not stay in the financial category. It moves into the body, the marriage, the parenting, the sleep, and the quality of judgment. A high break-even point creates a hidden tax on the nervous system. You wake up with it, you go to bed with it, you become less patient, less creative, less brave, and less generous under its pressure. And the worst part is that many men accept it as normal because their peers are equally burdened. Normal is not the same as healthy. A culture can normalize cages. The third cost is invisible dependence. When your household structure requires your current income level to continue without interruption, you are not merely employed. You are pinned. You cannot negotiate cleanly. You cannot change direction easily. You cannot take a strategic step backward to take a much stronger step forward later. You do not own your calendar psychologically, even if you own it legally. Every obligation becomes a vote for maintaining the status quo, whether the status quo deserves to be maintained or not. That is why some men who look established actually feel trapped. The surface image and the internal feeling are disconnected. They appear to have won, but they do not feel free. And eventually that gap becomes corrosive. The fourth cost is missed identity development. I want to explain this one carefully. When a man builds a life that constantly demands maximum output just to remain funded, he stops asking deeper questions. He becomes operational. He becomes managerial. He becomes the caretaker of a structure that leaves less room for becoming the person he might otherwise have become. Less room for patience, mastery, selective ambition, meaningful risk-taking, and the quiet confidence that comes from not needing to prove yourself with visible signals. Money can be used to purchase more life. It can also be used to purchase a more elaborate prison. The difference is not income. The difference is structure. So what should a man do? Not theatrics, not self-punishment, not fake minimalism. The answer is to reclaim optionality deliberately and with dignity. The first move is to audit obligations, not just spending. Ordinary budgeting advice is too small for this problem. The big money is not hiding in coffee. The big money is hiding in commitments. The man who wants his future back should make a clean list of every non-negotiable monthly obligation. Mortgage, rent, car payments, insurance, tuition, debt service, subscription creep, family support, anything that recurs whether he feels strong or weak that month. Then he should total it. That total is the real number. Not the salary, not the net worth headline, not the retirement projection. That total is the pressure line. It tells you how much life has already been promised away. Once you see the number, honestly, you can begin making adult decisions about whether your current structure deserves to survive unchanged. The second move is to separate identity from lifestyle. This is psychological work, but it has enormous financial consequence. A man who believes his dignity depends on the neighborhood, vehicle vacations, and visible signals attached to his life will find it almost impossible to make intelligent reductions. Every downgrade will feel like a verdict on his worth. That is a terrible way to live. Your dignity should not be leased. Your self-respect should not ride on a monthly payment. A strong man can drive an ordinary car and feel no smaller. A weak man can sit in a luxury car and remain insecure. The vehicle does not settle the matter. Character settles it. Once a man understands that, a fascinating thing happens. He becomes much harder to manipulate. Advertising loses force. Social comparison loses some of its poison. He begins to spend from preference rather than from performance. That shift alone can change the entire financial trajectory of a household. The third move is to ask with every major decision whether it adds freedom or subtracts freedom. This is my favorite question because it cuts through almost every rationalization. Does the larger house add freedom or subtract freedom? Does the new vehicle add freedom or subtract freedom? Does the extra obligation add freedom or subtract freedom? Does this purchase strengthen the balance sheet or simply polish the image? Does this commitment reduce my dependence on continued income or increase it? Over time, those questions create a better life than almost any budgeting app. The fourth move is to rebuild margin before you chase expansion. A household with low margin should not be chasing prestige purchases. It should be buying breathing room, emergency reserves, debt reduction, higher savings rates, investment contributions that happen automatically, insurance that is boring but adequate, systems that lower panic. Margin is not glamorous, but it is the soil in which intelligent behavior grows. A man with margin can stay invested when markets fall. A man with margin can endure a job transition without selling long-term assets at the wrong time. A man with margin can think. That alone is a competitive advantage. The fifth move is to convert income gains into asset ownership before converting them into consumption. This sounds simple. It is not easy, but it is powerful. When the next raise arrives, do not hand the entire raise to lifestyle. Force some portion of it into asset building automatically. Index funds, retirement accounts, business reserves, debt reduction if the debt is foolish. Productive assets first, improved lifestyle. Second, that ordering matters more than most men appreciate. If you reverse the order, lifestyle will consume the gain and ask for more. If you honor assets first, your future begins to strengthen even while your present life remains comfortable enough. I have never believed in living like a monk. I do believe in keeping enough distance between income and lifestyle that your household can compound. That difference changes everything. Let me speak directly to the father who says he is only doing this for his family. I understand the instinct. A man wants to provide. He wants to protect. He wants his children to have better conditions than he had. That is honorable. But providing is not the same as maximizing visible comfort. Providing means giving your family stability, margin, emotional steadiness, and a father who is not privately owned by his obligations. Children do not simply absorb square footage. They absorb atmosphere. They feel whether the home is peaceful or tense. They feel whether their father is present or perpetually strained. They feel whether money owns the adults in the house. A father who has chosen a slightly less impressive structure, but has greater calm, greater flexibility, and greater long-term stability may be giving his family far more than the father who reached for the largest structure he could technically service. Security is not the same thing as display. I would rather see a family living one notch below what society says they can afford, with a growing investment account, low panic, room to breathe, and the ability to recover from shocks, than living at the outer edge of qualification with no margin and permanent pressure. One version looks shinier, the other version survives. I know which one I prefer. There is also a positive compounding here that few men think about enough. When you lower the brake, even point, and rebuild optionality, you do not just reduce risk, you improve decision quality. You negotiate differently because you are less cornered. You evaluate opportunities more calmly because you are less desperate. You become more patient because you can afford patience. You become more selective because you no longer have to grab every dollar that appears. That often leads to better income opportunities over time. Freedom has a return profile. So does desperation. One compounds upward. The other compounds downward. I want to say something about milestones, because many men get this wrong. A savings milestone is not a graduation ceremony from discipline. It is the beginning of a new level of responsibility. If you reach 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, or some other meaningful capital base, and then immediately treat that as permission to inflate the household, you have misunderstood what progress is. The milestone is the foundation. It should make the next layer easier to build. It should not be used as an excuse to raise fixed costs and cut off the very compounding that made the milestone possible. You do not celebrate the laying of a foundation by making the building structurally weaker. You build on the foundation. That is how wealth is created. Now, let me describe the identity flip that I believe matters most in this decade. A younger man often asks, "What can I afford?" A wiser man begins asking, "What kind of life structure will let me remain strong, invested, and free for the next 20 years?" That is a profound shift. The first question is transactional. The second question is architectural. Between 35 and 45, you should be thinking like an architect of a long financial life, not like a consumer with a larger credit line. You should be designing a system that can absorb shocks, support compounding, and leave room for changes you cannot yet see, because changes will come. Careers will shift, industries will shift, health can shift, family demands can shift, markets will certainly shift. A rigid household breaks under pressures that a flexible household can survive. That is why I care so much about optionality. Optionality is not a vague luxury. It is a practical defense against the fact that the future refuses to honor our assumptions. I also want to address the man who feels shame reading something like this because he recognizes himself in it. Shame is useless if it turns into paralysis. Recognition is useful if it turns into action. You do not need to blow up your life to improve your life. You need to begin with one honest decision, one commitment you should not renew, one future upgrade you will not make, one payment you will accelerate out of existence, one category of spending you will stop treating as identity maintenance, one automatic investment increase that will happen before you can talk yourself out of it, one serious conversation with your spouse about what the household is actually trying to buy with all this effort. That is where change begins. Not with fantasy, with arithmetic and courage. I have seen households transform not because they suddenly doubled income, but because they changed the structure through which income flowed. They lowered the pressure line, they stopped congratulating themselves for looking successful, and started measuring whether they were becoming stronger. They replaced performative consumption with intentional ownership. They chose margin over image, and eventually found that peace feels better than prestige. Prestige is a weak sedative. Peace is a powerful asset. Now let me give you the practical protocol I would use if I were talking to a man in this exact window of life. First, calculate your true monthly obligation number with no excuses and no rounding tricks. Second, build or rebuild a cash buffer that protects the household from being forced into stupid decisions during shocks. Third, direct every new dollar of income to assets or debt reduction before lifestyle touches it. Fourth, identify the top 2 obligations that most restrict flexibility and make a real plan to reduce or eliminate them. Fifth, automate long-term investing so that building wealth is no longer dependent on your monthly mood. Sixth, define what enough looks like for your lifestyle before society defines it for you. Seventh, revisit every major household commitment by asking whether it serves the family's long-term freedom or merely its short-term image. That protocol will not impress shallow people. It will, however, put a man back in command of his financial life, and command matters. The man who commands his structure can be patient in markets, bold in negotiations, calm in downturns, generous without self-destruction, and present at home, because his nervous system is not being taxed by 1,000 silent obligations. That is a better form of success than the one most people chase. I want to close with a harder thought. Every decade has a test. In your 20s, the test is often discipline. In your 30s, it is often direction. Between 35 and 45, I think the test is whether you can recognize the difference between a life that looks bigger and a life that is actually stronger. Most men fail that test not because they are stupid, but because the world rewards the wrong signals and punishes visible restraint. It takes real independence to resist that. It takes a man who is willing to disappoint an image in order to protect a future. That is why this decade matters so much. If you get it wrong, you can spend your highest earning years turning yourself into a servant of your own structure. If you get it right, you can spend those years building the foundation for the freest phase of your adult life. So here is the final test I would give any man in that window. If your income stopped rising tomorrow, would the life you have built still feel like a good life? If you lost the current job, would your household structure give you time to think, or would it force you into fear immediately? If an extraordinary opportunity appeared that required temporary sacrifice, could you take it? If the market gave you a major decline and wonderful prices, would you have cash flow and emotional stability to buy, or would you be too stretched to act? If the answer to those questions is no, then the issue is not that you need more status. The issue is that you need more freedom, and freedom is usually built the same way wealth is built, quietly, deliberately, one smart decision at a time, not because anybody applauds it in the moment, because one day you wake up and realize the coffee is brewing, the house is quiet, and for the first time in years, you are not looking at your phone trying to figure out where it all went. You already know it did not disappear. You finally learned how to keep. You finally built a life that serves you back. And that is what real financial adulthood looks like.